here with Darryl Brown and Aydrelle Collins, and this is an experiment. It's really like my first experiment into what I want to call the front porch, important conversations that we have with members of our church and community. And welcome. Glad you're here. We're living in a world in which last summer you and I sat on this chancel after George Floyd, and we were really heartbroken. Now we're just post the verdict on the former officer Chauvin, past the insurrection attempt in the Capitol, so much going on. And I'm trying to think deeply about how stories heal us, heal our hearts, how they guide us, how they bring us into the world in moments like this. So I just want to open that up as an opportunity. What do stories do in our lives, and how are they important? And I think the connection, for me, the connection and how we're going to heal our world with all its issues has got to be that we get to a place of empathy, compassion, and love, right? And there's no answer in anything we've learned that more hatred and more anger is going to get us, more violence is going to get us to a place where our communities are whole, safe, connected. So, I was thinking about this, and we were talking a little bit about, what are the empathy stories in our lives that have shaped us in how we see each other. I was thinking about a story from, I mean, you don't know, maybe they don't know. I grew up in a very incredibly diverse community. I grew up with, I know that's kind of a cliche for a white person to say I had black friends, but I lived in people's homes that were very different than I was. And I saw moments where my best friend's dad was attacked, and he reached into the glove compartment for what I thought was a gun, and it came out with a can opener. And I just felt this incredible sorrow and just being horrified at people in my town who would say things to him that would have him reach for a weapon, and being stuck between us. So I saw moments like that. I was in the car. I was there. And I remember years later as a young adult working with this guy. We were working on tree trimming, and we drove into a part of a town that was all black, and he made a racist comment. And I heard it, and I stayed silent. And I had two reactions to myself. One was a deep shame that I didn't confront that. The other was a kind of compassion for his illness, his ignorance. And I wonder if what that sounds like to you, and what your sides of those kinds of stories are, and how you sort of respond to that.
Well, I have to say that, in my story is littered with incidents of hatred, hatred on the part of people I grew up with, parents of people I grew up with. So I've always responded in a way that I was dignified. I felt like I had to respond in a way that was dignified. I wasn't going to let them get to me, because I wanted them to understand. And maybe this is the compassionate part that I felt early on. I wanted them to understand that what they think is wrong. And their reaction to whatever I was doing was off base, right? And somehow I thought that was my responsibility. And I think that's a burden that I carried early on, and an unfair one, but I did. So I believe that I was always compassionate for what I saw as ignorance early on, and the burden that I felt that I had to carry. I knew it was unfair early on, but nothing was going to heal. Nothing was going to move forward unless I did that.
That's interesting hearing you say that, because growing up, I feel like I had the opposite growing up. I was military, so we moved around a lot, and I grew up around very diverse people, but in my household, it was very pro-Black. My dad grew up in segregated South Louisiana, and he didn't meet his first white person until he was 21, and so that came with its own racial trauma and the stories that he would tell me. I felt a lot of compassion for him, and my heart hurt really badly, and it still hurts really, really badly for Black people of a certain generation, because of all of the things that you all had to endure and carry, and that must be like a very scarring thing to walk around with. And so I never felt like I had to adjust myself to conform, or when someone said something ignorant or racist to me. I think I've handled it in times very not diplomatic and not as dignified as I should. And I don't know, it's something that I still struggle with. So I guess I can see where that compassion comes in, because the same compassionate space I can hold for my dad, I can see that when you were saying that people have been ingrained with these thoughts and these beliefs all of their lives. And it's, like you said, stories that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And that same hurt that my dad feels and that my dad experiences, I imagine, and with my empathetic mind, I can imagine that that's that same hurt. And, you know, whether they recognize it as hurt or whatever, that's something that they have to grapple themselves with. But I guess I can see where that compassion can start to come in.
So where does the heart come into this moment in the world? How do you bring your heart to all of what's happening?
You know, I'm going to go back to the mid-'60s when I was, 68, and all that was going on then. I think the entire country had to
You
find...
weren't 68 and 68.
No.
Okay, well, let's make sure. You'd be a great guy.
In 1968, in 1968, there was so much going on.
Yeah.
That I think that our hearts had to be into forgiveness, number one, because the world and the events, the people that were being taken out of our lives, and our leaders who were being taken out, the destruction that was going on around the world, it couldn't be like that. We weren't going to go on like that. So I say that to say this, Daniel, that my story is more about, it's not about being non-confrontational. I think my story is more about knowing that confrontation and fighting something is not going to get us anywhere. It's just not. So when I talk about being dignified in my responses to racial incidents, that was coming from the heart. That was my attempt to come from my heart of understanding, that maybe not understanding, but accepting what is in the moment, and knowing that if we're going to move forward once again, that a confrontation isn't going to get us there. It's just going to cause more pain. Right.
And it feels like certainly those who are on the far right of politics want the fight, right? So for instance, the investigation of the insurrection, the moderate Republicans are saying we have to focus on what happened in the insurrection. The right-wing Republicans are saying But there were Black Lives Matter people who were violent, which is just a lie. All the Black Lives Matter protests, arrests mostly have been erased, right? People have been let go. There was nothing there, right? But they want to make a fight. They want to fight. So how do we live in a world like that, where we're in these renewed battles, where people like us want to stand in love, but are being drawn into fights?
Well, what kind of fight? Because we are in a fight, but does it mean like a literal violent fight, or does it mean changing the systemic things that are causing all of these issues? That in itself is a fight. So I think we are in a fight, and in my brain anyway, it makes sense to me that fighting is what motivates me, and I'm not talking about violence. I'm not talking about physical fighting. I guess I'm talking about passion, and from that passion, that is love. Like, I love the potential. I love what this country could be so much that I am willing to fight for it. I'm willing to fight for a future for my son where he doesn't have to grow up in a world where he is fearful. I'm willing to fight for your sons so they don't have to grow up in a world like this. So I feel like we are in a fight, but it's just what type of fight, and what does that fight look like?
See, I'm glad you said that, because when we talk about fight, I am done with having the talk with my boys, who are 16 and 19. I'm done with that. I think the fight is amongst white people with themselves, and trying to understand, once again, amongst themselves, when are they going to find where the love button is? When are they going to find where the movement is, and who has to make the move in order to avoid fighting, right? Because where we are is where we always have been, and we've gotten the same results.
Yeah.
So obviously, it's not. I love solution. And it seems as if what's gone on, and especially in the last year, 13, 14 months, is people are invested in keeping the tension up. And it's that tension that tension for the election, tension around the verdict, tension around voter registration. You can't do this. It's that tension that I think makes people, puts people in the fight or flight mode.
Yeah, and I think some of the response to that in and of itself, especially for white people, is apathy. I mean, that's what I see, actually. Like when you say, I want you to fight for your son, you want to fight for his son, you should fight for my sons too, because my sons can slip into a kind of overwhelm of the climate, the politics, the world, the racism, and in a sense, the result can be apathy, so that we're actually not trying to make the world that we want to see, but that we go in the opposite direction. I am worried about that as well, and that's where the responsibility to enter into the breach, to stand in the fire with each other, holds me accountable. It's not giving up hope, and it's also not giving in to hatred. And that, to me, is the real meat of the matter in some sense. Very difficult to do this year with pandemic and the politics and, the events in the streets. The one hope I did have was I was down in some of those protests after George Floyd, and those were multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational events, and where people were standing shoulder to shoulder saying, this is not the world we want.
Yeah, I think the most like happy and my faith was restored because I was at the protest this summer too. Almost got arrested several times this summer. That was really,
Yeah.
but just being there, and I remember telling my mom this too. Like that is the most patriotic I felt when I was at the protest and going to the protest, because it was a beautiful thing to see multi-generational, multicultural, just people out in the streets. And every time I go to a march, that restores me in some way, and that gives me hope. That gives me it makes me see that things can change, and it gives me hope.
So I don't know where exactly to take that, but I agree with you. I don't want to just keep talking about it, although this is a conversation that maybe can move people out there to tell their stories, find their empathy stories, find their stories about what they learned about race, where they are on apathy, hope, and fear in the world. And once we start kind of hearing each other, then I think something happens. And I don't know what that something is, but I'm willing to see something happen.
So, we were talking earlier about Aydrelle's son, who's on a track team.
Yeah.
And, I am a firm believer. I used to be an athlete. I'm all for athletics, not for the competition, but for the bonding that teams actually get, and for the understanding that we need you. I need you. I need for you to perform in order for me to perform. So there is compassion in team building. There is, people who have been in the armed services. All of a sudden, white people, you talk to a white person, I've heard time and time again from the white men in the racial equity task force group, small group discussions. I've heard white men talk about fathers, grandfathers who have come back from the war or come back from the service, who have changed their attitudes altogether on race, because we're in this together. So that's where we need to get. And we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there by being a divided nation, right? We're just...
Yeah, that reminds me of something my dad used to tell us. I have 3 older brothers, and he would always say, like, you are your brother's keeper. And I know that's a Bible passage, but that has always stuck with me. And you're absolutely right. We can't move forward in this country unless we move forward together. And Daniel, I wanted to ask you something. You had mentioned shame. Do you feel that shame kind of contributes to apathy among white people? Like they get in the shame spiral?
I think it can.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what to do with it. You don't know how to... You don't know where to go with it. You don't know who to tell about it.
Yeah.
It silences people, right? I mean, shame's not just white shame. I mean, it can be anybody.
Yeah.
We see that in, like you drew me deeply into abortion rights issues by inviting me to the clinic, where I went from advocacy, which is a distant thing, to actually sitting with people who were about to have abortions, and I heard stories of deep shame that were then, there's a release valve in the storytelling to go back to that issue. I realized actually the women in that clinic didn't have people to tell their stories to, and that our chaplain crew that we created because of you was a story receiving team. And that healed hearts in one of the most difficult situations a woman can go through. And I think it plays a big role in us not behaving in the ways we want to behave, and being the people we want to be, who are living through the heart.
So yeah, how do we get people to reach into their hearts in order to avoid apathetic responses to what's going on in the world.
Right. And I think that apathy goes to, it doesn't affect me, so I don't have to deal with it. I don't have to recycle this bottle because it doesn't matter. I don't have to have a hard conversation with a person of color because it doesn't matter to me. I'm not the one, right? That's the apathy on one hand. On the other hand, I think a certain kind of apathy is, I'm just going to keep talking about race and racism, and without kind of telling my deep story or sort of processing it in a deep and heartfelt way. And I think we do both sometimes. We can be very rational about all the roots and problems and how race and racism develops and lives in our world, but without us saying, like, you know what, that moment when I was 25 years old or whatever, that still lives with me. And every time I'm with you, I remember that moment because I let you down, even though I didn't know you back then, you know?
Yeah.
And those stories that we can reveal are like the shame stories that heal the heart. And to me, that's the beginning of, it maybe is just the beginning of the conversation, but it's the kind of beginnings we need.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. Because I'll tell you, when we tell our stories, we understand that we are all broken. There is a brokenness in all of us. And that's the connective tissue that I think is going to heal this country. I think that's going to heal this country, when we understand that we all have brokenness inside of us.
Yeah, and it's a choice to move out of that place of shame. Like you were saying with the story, when you were 25, you were consciously making or unconsciously making that choice to move out of a place of shame and to connect and to have these issues, and not internalizing that, because I feel like that is where people get stuck too. They tell their race stories and they have something that they are not so proud of, and they almost get into this panic of, well, I'm not a racist, and if I tell this story, is this person going to think I'm a racist, and what if they think I'm a racist? And that stops it right there in its tracks. So there's another side of apathy as well, that the problem is just so big and so overwhelming that I am not going to be able to make a difference, so why should I start to try in the first place?
Yeah, it's a kind of defense. Yeah.
So doesn't that sound like fear of exposing who you really are?
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely. And if there's one thing this church tries to do, is help people live into who they really are, right? I mean, this is the matter that is deep in the Love Beyond Belief work. It's deep in the core theology of our church, that we should not be in closets of any kind. And we should be in dialogue, and we should really try to deepen the spirit, a spiritual response to the world. In some ways, those aren't all the things about our faith, but I think those are foundational.
Yeah, I think it's also important when we talk about telling our stories in this small group setting, we've already established a base of trust. And everyone knows that what's said there stays there. So it lends itself to tell, for people to tell more authentic stories.
Yeah. And I like the idea of telling a story where you're not the hero in the story, because I think that's another kind of defense mechanism. And I hope that that's what we can do more of, that's where the vulnerability lives, right?
Daniel, I have to see that in you. I have to see that in you and connect with that in you, because our vulnerability, my vulnerability has been out there. It's Well, by the
It's
mere
walking
color.
around, yeah.
That's right.
It's walking around,
That's
right.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Right. I'm vulnerable all the time. And so I want to know that you can meet me there.
Yeah, I get that.
Right.
That is a whole other conversation in itself, because when people tell their stories, they always want like where they were the hero, where they stepped up and they did something, or they did this or they did that, and that's always not necessarily the case. So how authentic are you really being in telling your story? So I think that's another part of it too, is like, can you be your authentic self? And like we were saying at the end, can you sit with your authentic self, like all of it, because it's all a part of you, and you don't have to make it like this sugar-coated thing. Like, we're not looking for that, and that is not what's going to help heal us and move forward. And so
I appreciate you coming, Aydrelle and Darryl. So glad to be in dialogue with you, even in this beginning. I look forward to more, and thanks for being here.
thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. That's why I belong to this church.
All right.